My name is Manuel Matuzovic. I'm a front-end developer from Vienna. This is interesting. This color is actually red on my screen. Bright red. Okay, we'll see how that goes. Please turn the light back. Okay. Yes, as already mentioned, I work for the city of Vienna. I'm responsible for Wien GVAT, not the old one, but in the future the new one, and other front-end stuff by the city of Vienna. I'm specialized in HTML and CSS and especially accessibility in the web. If you're interested about HTML, CSS and accessibility stuff, you'll find me on Twitter as mmatuzo. Contrast is really bad. I'm an accessibility guy and the contrast is bad. Cool.
The whole light system is connected to one switch, which means that if you turn it off, nobody has light on this floor. So I kind of feel we have to. I'm very sorry.
Okay, we'll see how that goes. Okay.
Smart system. So you can turn it on.
Okay, let's try it. We'll see. Nobody of you has a laptop? Okay, but because the slides are already online, so if you wanted to follow along, you could. It's on bit.ly/dark-grid-linz. Today I'm here to talk about CSS Grid Layout. I want to show you how awesome Grid is. Who of you is using it already in production, CSS Grid Layout? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10-ish. Okay. I want to show you how cool Grid is. I'm going to introduce Grid to you, but especially I want to show you the dark side of the Grid. Okay, those are actually rainbow colors, so yeah. So, CSS Grid Layout is a grid-based layout system designed for two-dimensional layouts. It's a perfect fit if you don't just work on one axis, but on both axes. So, if that's the case, then Grid is what you need. And the cool thing about Grid is it's the first true layout method in CSS. Before that, we didn't have anything for layout. Of course, we had or still have stuff like float and display inline block. If you're brave, you can build layouts using position or display table, and of course there's also flexbox, but all of those were not designed for building multi-dimensional layouts. Who of you had the pleasure of building layouts using HTML tables? Who is old enough? You are not. Oh, wow. Not bad, not bad. And the fun thing is, CSS Grid Layout is kind of like building layouts using tables, but the big difference is you write it in CSS and not HTML, so you don't need extra markup. And it's flexible and responsive and accessible and awesome. The inventors of CSS, or the people behind CSS, wanted to implement grids, not CSS Grid Layout, but Grid in general, in CSS very early on, because they were inspired by what designers were doing in magazines and in books. So they wanted to bring that to the web as well. In the early 90s, they had the first ideas for Grid in the web or in CSS, but it was just too complex to implement. Then in the mid-90s, there was a proposal for a thing called the frame-based layout module, but it never found its way into any browser. That's the same for the advanced layout module, which was introduced or presented in 2005. So there were many ideas on how to get grids into CSS. And then all of a sudden Microsoft came along and they built this operating system with the layout you all so love. And what they wanted to do is to enable web developers to build applications for the operating system for Microsoft 8 using web technology, so HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And as you can see here, this layout is very griddy. So they realized, okay, you can't build such a thing using Flexbox or Float, or of course you can, but you're not very flexible doing that. So they had to come up with something new, and they did. The first implementation of Grid was shipped behind the MS vendor prefix in IE10, 8 years ago. So CSS Grid Layout is 8 years old, actually. 1 year later, Microsoft presented the first draft of their specification to the W3C, and the W3C liked it. So the CSS working group took Microsoft's proposal and some ideas from the older ones, from the frame-based layout module and the advanced layout module, and they put things together for a whole new specification with superpowers. So they had a new draft, and the way things go in the way the W3C puts out recommendations is that if you have a draft, you need at least 2 separate implementations in browsers. So there was the first one in Microsoft, and they needed another browser to implement Grid. But browser vendors were kinda gun shy because they had a bad experience with another specification. CSS regions. Who of you has heard of CSS regions? Okay, 1 and a half, or is it 2? Yeah, 2, okay. 3 people maybe. Yeah, you can see why, because one browser implemented it, the other one wasn't sure, then the next browser implemented it, but then reverted. There was a lot of back and forth, and in the end, there are no CSS regions. And many browser vendors thought that the same thing will happen with Grid. So nobody wanted to implement it. Yes, I drink beer during a talk, I'm sorry. And then all of a sudden Bloomberg came along, the media company Bloomberg, and they hired Igalia, it's a software consultancy, and they wanted them to implement Grid in WebKit and Blink. So for some reason, Bloomberg really wanted Grid. And that's what Igalia did, and the rest is history. In early 2017, Chromium 56 for Android was the first browser to ship Grid, and then in early March, Chrome and Firefox followed. By the end of March, Opera and Safari, and I have this date tattooed on my breast on October 17th, Edge. So all major desktop browsers and mobile browsers ship, yes, really, yeah. Here Michael Heupel, and here the date of so all major browsers ship the specification within a year, which is huge because there is a lot of stuff going on in Grid. Actually, there's so much new stuff in Grid, so many new properties, new updated properties and values, related specifications, updated related specifications, new functions and so on, that I can't tell you everything about those things. But if you want to learn anything about Grid, find me in one of the breaks and I'm happy to answer everything I know. All right, that's that about Grid. Now before I talk about accessibility and CSS Grid Layout, I shortly have to address the name and the theme of this talk. Of course, it's based on the LP The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, which was released in 1973. What you see here is an original pressing of The Dark Side of the Moon from 1973. My father gave it to me when I was 5 years old. And ever since, I'm a huge Pink Floyd fan. Nah, I'm just kidding. I bought this 3 months ago for 15 euros in Poland. I'm really not a Pink Floyd fan. I bought it because I talk a lot about Pink Floyd and The Dark Side of the Moon, but I don't know their music. Really, I don't know. I know Stefan is really disappointed. But look at the cover, it's so beautiful. It's just a nice illustration. I had to steal the title. I'm so sorry. But I'm pretty sure that I'm not the only person in this room who doesn't know anything about Pink Floyd. So I present to you Pink Floyd fun fact number 1. The Dark Side of the Moon is, with over 45 million copies sold, the 4th best-selling album worldwide. Who's number 3? AC/DC with Back in Black. On number 2, for whatever reason, the greatest hits by the Eagles. And number 1, of course, Thriller by Michael Jackson. Visual order is the first thing I want to talk about, or actually changing visual order. The Grid specification provides us with many different ways of changing order in Grid. There is explicit placement, there is the order property, there is absolute positioning, which you can combine with explicit placement, which is very interesting. There's the autoflow property, and there are areas. Now I'm going to talk about all of those, but before I do that, I want to talk about visual order in general. The way order works is that both the tab order, so the order in which the focus indicator jumps from one item to the next item when you press the tab key, and the order in which a screen reader reads content on a page, follow DOM order. So tab order and screen reader order jump from top to bottom in a page. If we use CSS and change the visual order, tab order and screen reader order still stay the same. And this may be a problem for some people. So if you have a document, and let's say those are HTML elements, and the visual order, so the order in CSS is the same as the order in HTML, everything is fine. But as soon as we start changing the visual order in CSS, there is a mismatch between DOM order and visual order. And this might be a problem. Let me give you an example. Let's say we have a paragraph with some links and a form. If I press tab now, you can see that the focus indicator jumps from the first item to the second, to the third one, and so on. It's pretty easy to use and predictable. Now, if the DOM order, so the order in HTML is wrong and I fix it by placing items differently in CSS, you can see that now it's not very predictable where focus will jump next because visual order doesn't match DOM order anymore, and this is a problem. It's a problem for, as already mentioned, keyboard users because they might have troubles predicting where focus will go next, but it's also might be an issue for users of screen magnifiers because they might be confused when the area that's zoomed in skips around a lot. Here's a very simplified example. I have a gallery here or something that could be a gallery, and what you see here on the left hand side is the zoomed in part of this page. I'm using the built-in zoom in macOS. So now I'm going to press tab. And you can see the zoomed in area skips around a lot, and it's very hard to follow where you are in the page. Of course, this is just a component, so on a component level it's not that hard, but think about it on a page level. And if stuff skips around a lot, that might be very confusing. And if visual order doesn't match DOM order, it might also be problematic for a blind user who's working together with a sighted user. And if they discover information in different order, this can get very confusing. Also, not all screen reader users are blind. So some have low vision, so they see some parts of the screen and they hear other parts. Or in addition, they hear stuff. According to the screen reader survey of 2017, 75% of participants were blind and 20% had low vision. So not every screen reader user is blind. Okay, so we know that the mismatch between visual order and DOM order is a problem. But who's using a keyboard anyways on the web? Well, people with physical disability who cannot use a mouse. For example, someone who has just one arm. Or people with chronic conditions such as repetitive stress injury. People who should limit or avoid the usage of a mouse. Or people who temporarily can't use a mouse because they have an injury, a broken arm. Or I met a girl in Budapest and she told me that she wasn't able to use a mouse for 2 weeks because she got her forearm tattooed. It just hurts too much. Also, Stefan might sometime use a keyboard when he's holding his kid in one arm and he has to check something online or write some JavaScript or whatever. Okay. Or you might even want to use a keyboard on the web because you're all power users, I guess. We use the keyboard a lot in Photoshop, in Sketch, in VS Code, and Vim, of course. So, Or if you have an empty magic mouse, absolutely. So, and who uses a screen reader? A screen reader is a software that reads content on a page. That's a simplified explanation. Blind people, people with low vision who supplement what they see on the screen with a screen reader, and people with learning disabilities, for whom it's easier to listen to content than to read it. All right, now let's talk about grids. The first thing I want to talk about is explicit placement. Let's say we have this is orange. It's orange, believe me. Let's say we have a 3x3 grid with 9 items. If I press the tab key here, you can see that the focus jumps from the first item to the second, to the third, and then it skips to the second row and so on. It's very easy to follow. Now, grid gives us the ability to place items in every cell we want. We can place them anywhere in the grid. This is so cool. And it's not absolute positioning. The items are still in the document flow, so that's really cool. We can use the grid column property or the grid row property and place items on any line. So I could, for example, select the first child item and place it on the second column and the second row. Or I can select the second one and place it on the third, and so on. It might look something like this. So I can reorder all the items in my grid, and if I now press tab, it's very hard to follow where focus will go next. Yes, I know for you it's easy because there are numbers, but usually we don't have numbers on websites, so usually it's not that easy to follow where focus will go next. So that's the first technique in Grid. The second one is the order property. You might already know it already from Flexbox. It works the same way. You can use the order property on Grid items as well and reorder them in the Grid. So order doesn't just work with Flex, but with Grid as well. And we get the same result, again, with a mismatch between visual order and DOM order. Another really, really cool property is the autoflow property. We can build grids like that as well. So we can make grid items span multiple rows or multiple columns. That's fairly easy. It's kind of like using row span and col span in tables. And we can make layouts like this. That's really cool. This layout is neatly aligned because I took care that all the different sizes fit together perfectly. But sometimes, especially if you're using implicit placement and explicit placement, so you could say manual placement and automatic placement, it might happen that you get those gaps you see here, and that doesn't look too nice. Of course, if it is brutalism, it's fine, because, you know, we're fancy, it's brutalism, it's okay to be ugly. But if you want to get rid of those gaps, you can try to place items manually again, or you just use the grid autoflow property and set the value to dense. And then grid switches from a sparse packing mode to a dense packing mode, and it tries to fill those gaps. And then we get this. Pretty awesome. Grid does that automatically. It just locates gaps and reorders stuff, and then we get this packed layout again. But again, we now have a mismatch between visual order and DOM order. I'm so sorry for disappointing you for so many minutes, but we'll get to the good part later. The next thing is areas, and areas are really, really awesome. Let's say we have a layout like this, a typical mobile layout with a header, we have some main content, then we have ads and a newsletter, area and a footer. Now what's cool about areas in Grid is that we can describe this layout in HTML, and not just in HTML, but in CSS as well. So I could select the parent of those items and define the grid template areas property and define different areas here. So I can define an area for the header, for the content, for ads and newsletter and footer. Right now, this might seem redundant, because why would I do that in CSS if I already have it in HTML? Well, let's say Stefan is organizing the next ScriptConf and he really has to push the newsletter signups. He really wants people to sign up for the newsletter because it has some important news. And he tells the developer, hey, please move this newsletter sign up above the content. We really, really have to promote this. Now, what the front-end developer should do is to go to the HTML document and move it up in the DOM, but you don't have to. The only thing you have to do in Grid is to just move this line up, and that's it. No absolute positioning, no negative margins or anything. That's it. We've changed the order just in CSS, and this is really, really cool. But again, we have this mismatch between DOM order and visual order. And of course, on this screen, it's not that hard to follow, but usually the main content is much larger, so the focus would jump from the top down to the bottom, back up, and then back down. Now, of course, I know that you are smart. You're going to say, yeah, but who uses a keyboard on mobile? Well, according to the screen reader survey of 2017, 15% use a keyboard with, at least of those participants, use a keyboard with their smartphone. And another thing is, grid template areas doesn't just apply for mobile layouts, but you can use it on larger screens as well. So if you take this keyword and repeat it, it means that it now spans 2 columns. So the header area spans the 2 columns I've defined at the top. That's the same for the newsletter. The contents area is in the first column, the ads area in the second, and so on. So areas are really cool, but dangerous at the same time. So I've showed you many cool things and many ways of destroying the experience for a lot of people, and you can see that we have a lot of responsibility. I mean, we had it all the time. We can do reordering with float and with absolute positioning and flexbox, but with grid it gets much easier, and it's so much easier to fuck things up. Now, we should ask ourselves the question, whose responsibility is it to fix that? Is it our responsibility, or maybe browser vendors should take care that we don't get this mismatch between visual order and DOM order? Now, I have a strong opinion about that. I'm not going to say it, but let's look at our options. What can we do if the browser vendors don't fix anything? Well, we could dynamically change source order for every breakpoint using JavaScript. Nope. We could apply tab index or aria flow to all elements and reorder them accordingly. If you use tab index, you can change the way the tab focus jumps from one item or the order of the tab index, but that's a bad practice. And aria flow to, you could use it to change the order in which screen readers read content, but it's not very well supported, and it's also a bad practice. So that's not going to work. We could try browser sniffing and send different HTML to different clients and device types. I think we're all on the same boat when it comes to browser sniffing. It's not that good of an idea. We could mitigate the problem by providing skip links. Well, we should provide skip links anyways in most of the time. Who knows what skip links are? Okay. Please find me after this talk. I'm going to show you what skip links are. Skip links are really important. I'm going to show you later. Or we could just not change visual order. That's a great tip. That's actually what the W3C recommends. Authors must use order and the grid placement properties only for visual, not logical reordering of content. Leonie Watson, a accessibility expert, says this: brilliant on the one hand for them trying to at least advise everybody in the right direction, but really, come on. Suggesting that we don't all use it just because of this, I think, is wishful thinking. And she's also not just an accessibility expert, but a blind developer, so she knows, really knows firsthand what she's talking about. And we all have these amazing possibilities in Grid. We are going to use them, definitely. So what do we do? Well, we should think about source order before we write HTML and CSS and JavaScript. Even before we design anything, we should work closely with designers and think about stuff like order before we start typing. We should start with a well-structured HTML document. I know that in 2019 we all work with React and Angular and Vue and so on. We work mostly on a component level, but we must also take care of the document context and see those components in the whole document context and test them, not just separately. We should write CSS mobile first, at least that's a personal tip, because that works very well for me, and change the layout according to screen sizes. And we should test what we've built using the tab key. The tab key will tell you so much about your website and your CSS and HTML skills. Believe me. Just when you get home, open the last project you've built and press the tab key and see if you can use it without the mouse. If not, feel free to contact me on Twitter, and I'm going to help you to make it accessible. Yes, and if there is a mismatch between visual order and DOM order, don't try to fix it using JavaScript or CSS. Try to go back to the source order to HTML and fix it there. The Dark Side of the Moon spent 736 weeks on the American Billboard chart. That's 14 years. And I still haven't listened to it. Jesus Christ. Compromising on semantics is the next topic. Experts like Rachel Andrew have already very early feared that developers will start to compromise on semantics just in order to be able to use Grid. She says, I believe there will be a strong temptation, especially with Grid, to flatten out document structure in order that all elements become a child of the element with the Grid declared, making layout simple, but at what cost? I'm going to show you in an example what she means by that. Let's say we have a form. In this form I have two divs, and in each div there is a label and an input. One says what's your name and the other one says email. And then I have a field set and a legend, and in the legend it says shirt size, and I have two radio buttons with the label S and M for small and medium. And this is how my form looks like. It's okay, it Doesn't look nice, but it's okay. What I want now is I want all labels and legends to align in the first column or in the first column, and all input fields in a second column. Easy cheesy, I just select the form, I set display to grid, I use the grid's template columns property to define 2 columns. The max content keyword will make the first column only as wide as the largest child item, so I don't have to define a fixed pixel number or whatever. It will just make it as wide as the largest label. This is really, really cool. And then I define a second column, and I use the grid gap property for some space between my input fields. And this is what I get, or what we get. Does anyone know why it doesn't look like I wanted it to look like? Because only direct child items of a grid container will be placed in the grid. So in our example, the 2 divs and the field set, but not the labels and the input. I'm a web developer now for 11 years. Yes, 11 years. I know my HTML, and I'm a pusher. So I'm going to get rid of the divs. This is a red line, so the divs are crossed out. I'm going to get rid of the field sets. I'm going to change the legend to strong. I'm going to put a wrapper around the radio buttons, and bam, problem solved. Looks nice. The problem is that this form is now less semantic and harder to use for screen reader users, because we've removed a lot of information, especially with the field set. And the document is hard to scan without CSS. You can see that if the CSS doesn't work, the form doesn't look nice. Now, of course, I know nobody disables CSS, nobody disables JavaScript, nobody disables CSS. But have you ever been to Italy, and have you used the public Wi-Fi in Italy on vacation? It doesn't work at all. You're happy if you get HTML over the wire. At least it happened a lot of times to me that I only got HTML and no CSS and JavaScript. Okay, so this is not a solution. Don't compromise on semantics. What can we do? Well, we could use a thing called subgrid. Subgrid is so cool. A grid container that is itself a grid item can defer the definition of its rows and columns to its parent grid container, making it a subgrid. Or, in other words, a grid item can pass its grid item characteristics to its child items, so the child items will become part of the grid as well, or actually instead of the grid item. This is really awesome. So we can just select the div and the field set display to grid, and grid template columns to subgrid. And that's it. We don't have to do anything else. And subgrid is actually one of the few properties. This is green. It's not red, it's green. One of the few properties that works in every single browser, even in Opera Mini, in UC browser. No, I'm just kidding. It doesn't work in any browser. It's all red. It's not supported yet. It's part of level 2 of the grid specification. It will ship in the future, so we can't use it now. But as soon as it gets shipped in any browser, we can use it. Okay, what else? We could use display contents. Display contents is also really cool. If you apply display contents to an element, its children will act as if the element does not exist. So we could apply display contents to the div, and the label and the input would just say, okay, div doesn't exist, we are now grid items. So we just select the div, we select the field set, we set display to contents, and that's it. Now, I guess you know how this talk works. I'm sorry, but Edge doesn't support display contents. And this, of course, isn't a problem, because we can fix this by applying progressive enhancement and providing some other solution. The problem is that Edge doesn't support display contents because there is a bug in Chrome, Safari, Opera, and iOS, and Chrome for Android. And this bug is a very severe bug. If you set display contents on any element, it will be removed from the accessibility tree. So if you set display contents to an H2, it just doesn't exist for screen reader users. It's gone, like setting display none. And so actually it's like this. Edge is waiting for Chrome to fix it, and as soon as Chrome fixes it, Edge will ship the feature. So yeah. We can't use display contents, I'm really sorry. Here's an example. Let's say we have this field set, and you can see that the legend of the field set is shirt size, and we have 2 labels, small and medium. And let's try sound.
New S, selected radio button, 1 of 2 shirt size. M, selected radio button, 2 of 2 shirt size.
So I'm using voice over here, the built-in screen reader in macOS, and you can hear that when I select one of those radio buttons, it says M selected, radio button 2 of 2, shirt size. So it reads the legend with the option. This is really great if you have a lot of options, especially such options as S and M, because I might not know to which area or field they relate to. And this is quite helpful that it reads the legend out as well. So tip, don't put any sentences or long definitions in the legend, just short descriptions. Now, if I apply display contents to this field set, it sounds
S
like this.
selected radio button 1 of 2. M selected radio button 2 of 2.
Did you spot the difference? So the radio buttons are still accessible, but the field set in the legend don't exist anymore. And of course, this doesn't just apply to field sets or anything. You could use display contents as a reset for lists, for example. You can select the unordered list or ordered list and get rid of list style type, padding, and margin with just one property. But this is completely inaccessible to screen reader users. It's gone, it doesn't exist. So for now, we can't use display contents. I actually never realized that this talk is so negative. Let's talk about some positive things. In 1975, Pink Floyd helped to finance the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail by the comedy group Monty Python. Some other investors were Led Zeppelin and Genesis.
I have a Led Zeppelin tattoo.
Oh, really?
Don't say anything bad about that.
I have a
I'm a Monty Python fan and a Genesis fan. So
okay. Okay. I gave this talk in Germany last year, and I talked about what's the name of the band? Pink Floyd, and about and about Genesis. And someone in the audience asked me, "Do you know Genesis?" And I was like, "Yeah, I know that one song." And then what he did, he was in the audience. He opened up Amazon and started an Amazon wish list, and he sent it to me with some LPs and movies I should listen to and watch to. Cross-browser support. Okay, yeah. Grid history again. Microsoft shipped the first implementation behind the MS vendor prefix in 2011, and all the other browsers shipped their implementation in 2017. And the difference between the two implementations is huge. So you can see all those. There are red crosses here all over. So you can see all those properties exist in the new specification, and this is just what we have in the old one. So the only thing you can do with the old specification, with the prefixed specification in IE 10 and IE 11, is to draw explicit grids and place items explicitly. So there's no automatic placement, there are no gaps, and a lot of features are missing. But if you want to use it, you can. You define the properties for new browsers, and then you just use the prefixed properties for columns and rows. And let's say we have a 2x2 grid with 4 items. This is what we get in Chrome. Looks nice. And this is what we get in IE. The problem is there is a grid, but we have to explicitly place every item. There is no automatic placement, and this sucks. So we would have to select every single item and place them on our lines and rows. And then we have the same result. So it works, but you have to do a lot of manual work. So if you have this very specific use case where you have a defined number of columns and rows and you have a fixed position for every item, use the old specification if you want to. Oh, and if you don't need gaps, because there are no gaps. So we can put spaces between those lines and rows. But what about Autoprefixer? Isn't there anything Autoprefixer can do? Those guys are smart. I'm sure they have a solution for us. Well, let's see. First of all, you have to enable auto-prefixing for grid properties, because the specifications are so different that the maintainers decided to make it opt-in. So you have to explicitly define that you want to prefix grid properties. And if you do that, let's say we have this display property, we define some colors and rows and gap and so on, then you will get the prefixed properties here. And if we zoom in a little bit, we will see that we get prefixes. There's a red border around the grid gap property for all properties but the grid gap property, because again, no gaps in the old specification. But Autoprefixer wouldn't be Autoprefixer if they didn't have a solution for that. What you have to do is to use the grid template shorthand, and define the columns and rows. And then you will get fake columns and rows with the width of the grid gap property between all the real columns and rows. That's really creative. But if you ask me, it just creates false assumptions, and it's very dangerous because you have to very well document that this is going on, that that you're not allowed to change it, and that you have to let things be as they are. And there are some more gotchas. So you have to use the grid templates or grid template areas property for defining grids. The usage of duplicate area names is very limited. There are no negative line numbers. I'm not sure if this is telling you anything, but I'm just going keep going. The grid shorthand is not supported. Align content, justify content, and place content don't work, unfortunately. And it's not possible to define end lines only. They have some solutions for auto placement. So what's actually not available in the old specification, they have a solution for that, but it's also very limited. So again, you have to define rows and columns. There is no automatic placement. Autofit and autofill don't work. You can't mix explicit and implicit placement. You can't place pseudo elements. And you have to redeclare the grid gap property if you are using media queries. So it's possible, but it's, yeah, there are a lot of gotchas. Why would we use the old specification anyways? Who cares about IE and IE11? Let me see some hands. Who has to optimize for IE11? Okay, pretty much anyone. According to ÖVA.at, 7.9% of all users are IE users, and if we just look at desktop users, it's 21% in Austria. And those numbers are based on huge or large sites on Austria, like Willhaben and so on. And browser support seems to be a barrier for developers. Someone asked online, if you haven't used CSS Grid yet, it's because Flexbox is fine. I mean, that's fine if Flexbox is fine, right? And 30% said IE support. And I think that shouldn't be a barrier. If we apply progressive enhancement, we can serve older browsers or legacy browsers a basic layout version of our sites and then just improve the experience for newer browsers. At least that's how I do it. All right, I told you a lot of things, a lot of bad things, annoying things about, or at least potentially dangerous things about grids. And now, what are you going to do? Are you going to use it in production, try it out, see what you can do, or is it just too hot of a topic for you, too dangerous because you can ruin the experience for too many people? I don't know. I will tell you what I do. I'm going to answer it with a quote by my very favorite band, Pink Floyd. There is no dark side of the grid really. Matter of fact, it's all dark. It's all dark. No, of course it's not. Use grid. Grid is so great. I'm using it in production for more than a year. Just use it responsibly. So if you use grid template areas or grid flow to grid flow or anything, just don't use it on very interaction sensitive components like a gallery where it would make a lot of sense to use it, but at least test it. Test it with your keyboard a lot and test it on different screen sizes. That's really important. Don't compromise on semantics. If you see yourself compromising on semantics just in order to be able to use grid, don't use grid. Take care of HTML. HTML is very important. If you're using Autoprefixer, make sure that everybody in your team knows what's going on and what's happening, and I don't know, link to the documentation or comment the code really well so everybody knows why things are the way they are. And make sure that your components work in older browsers and less capable browsers, and embrace the power of progressive enhancement. Thank you very much, Linz.
Thank you, Manuel. I have to make another wish list, I guess. All right, so thank you, Manuel, for this wonderful talk. Very incredible. I always wanted to end with these words. Matter of fact, it's all dark. What an uplifting talk. So let's use our flesh-gained mood and storm the beer fridge. And now the buffet is open right now. You can have drinks. Don't forget this nice little box where you could put in coins and bills. And where's the person who's doing the tours? Wave your hand. Miriam? You're doing the tours? All right, so if you want to have a tour through the Grand Garage, Miriam is happy to to give you one. Let's do a 30 to 40 minute break. We meet again at roughly 8:30. See you then. Bye-bye.